The West Coast in the 90s was pure chaos, and at the center was one man who had the whole industry terrified, Suge Knight.
I think that even more so now, I think that Suge Knight is an evil human being.
But there was one cat who refused to bow down to the death row kingpin, and that man was none other than Ice Cube.
What makes them so mad is when you don't want to be a part of their club.
At one point, Suge and his crew tried to strong-arm Cube into submission, but that move backfired in the worst way. Let me break it down. When hands got thrown. See, when most people in the industry heard Suge Knight's name, they started sweating bullets. Everybody wanted to be his friend because of the power.
You know, we in gangster cars, and he's in the Porsche. People was moving out the way for us, but shaking his hand.
This dude was 6'4", over 300 pounds of pure intimidation, rolling around with actual gang members from Mob Piru Bloods, like he was running some kind of street corporation.
Yeah, he has some real dudes behind him. That's an absolute fact. It's a well-known thing.
But Cube? Nah, homeboy was built different. We talking about a dude from Compton who grew up in the trenches and had stories about almost taking somebody out over scamming his own mama. That's the kind of street credibility that don't back down from nobody. The first time these two titans clashed was back in 1989, and let me tell you, it was straight up legendary. DJ Premier, who was there to witness this whole thing go down, broke it down for us later. Picture this scene. It's early in Cube's solo career, right after he bounced from NWA because of all that financial drama with Jerry Heller and Eazy-E. Suge was still working as muscle for Ruthless Records at the time, basically serving as Eazy's enforcer and bodyguard. Now, Premier was standing right there when this whole situation popped off at some promotional show in LA. The tension in the air was thick because everyone knew Cube had just left NWA and Ruthless Records wasn't happy about it. When Premier tells the story, you can hear the excitement in his voice about witnessing this historic moment.
I was excited just to see all the NWA members, and we're about to go on stage, and we had an intro, and we're standing by the door, and JJ Fad standing by me. I'm like, oh, JJ Fad, and just excited just to be there. And all of a sudden I see a ruckus, and I just see, Cube's throwing his fist.
But here's where it gets real spicy. This wasn't no Hollywood slap fight or some weak push and shove situation. Premier made it crystal clear that Cube was throwing hands right back at Suge, and I'm talking about real punches. Most cats in the industry would have folded under the pressure, especially going up against someone with Suge's reputation for violence. But Cube, he stood his ground like a true soldier from the hood.
And I just see, Cube's throwing his fist. He wasn't punking out at all.
Now let's talk about what made this fight so significant. This wasn't just some random beef between two dudes. This was symbolic of everything that was happening in the West Coast rap scene at the time. Suge was trying to establish his dominance using fear and intimidation to control artists and executives. The fact that Cube refused to back down sent a message throughout the industry that not everybody was going to fall in line with Suge's strong-arm tactics. What makes this even crazier is that nobody ended up in the hospital after this scrap.
No one got knocked out, no one got beat up, but there was from what I can remember, I saw Suge somewhere in that vicinity, but no one came out unconscious.
It was quick, heated, but both dudes walked away still breathing. But the mind games that came after, that's where the real damage was done. Premier made it clear that while the whole hip-hop scene was shook of Suge Knight, Cube didn't even flinch when it came to throwing hands with this giant. That's some next-level fearlessness right there, especially when you're squaring up with somebody who rolls with actual killers and ain't scared to get violent. But hold up, because the drama was just getting started. The real wild shit went down at the Anaheim Celebrity Theater, and this whole situation was straight up dirty. We talking about Above the Law, Lay Law, Cold 187, KMG, and Go Mac from Ruthless Records, basically ganging up on Cube in what was clearly a planned attack. JD from Day Lynch Mob, who rode with Cube's crew, spilled the real tea about what happened at that Anaheim show. This wasn't some spontaneous backstage drama. This was a straight up ambush designed to embarrass Cube and make him bow down to Ruthless Records' power in LA.
So it was a setup.
It was a setup, and Suge had his hands in that. Suge had his hands in that.
The way it played out was some real gangster movie type stuff. JD, Jinx, and T1 got snuck in through a back entrance, already sus as hell.
The that happened at Anaheim Celebrity Theater.
Right.
They wouldn't let me and Jinx and T-Bone through the back door.
During the show, Cube and Hutch from Above the Law started going at it, and Cube ended up with his face scratched up and his lip busted. But here's where Cube showed what he was really made of. JD was ready to turn up by waving to the Compton and Hoover Crips in the crowd to storm the stage and make this a full-scale riot. But Cube shut that down. He was cool with the one-on-one fight he had with Hutch.
After that bull went down and Ice Cube and Hutch got their little squabble out of the way, whatever happened in the dressing room happened in the dressing room, I saw Cube right afterwards. He had a little scratch on on his lip, little scratch on his face. I said, you straight on? He like, yeah, it wasn't over the squabble. I said, you want to go back in there and get out with these? He's like, nah, we ain't got to trip off that. We go back out here.
That's the difference between somebody who's genuinely built for this life versus somebody just trying to flex for the cameras. Cube could have turned that whole place into a war zone, but he kept it strictly between him and whoever had smoke. This whole above the law drama was connected to the ongoing label wars, with Suge's involvement coming from his early ties to Ruthless before he started Death Row. At this point, he was still doing muscle work for Eazy-E, but he was already building his reputation for using fear and violence to get results. This whole situation set up years of tension between Cube and the Death Row crew. It wasn't just personal drama, it was about two completely different approaches to surviving in the music industry. Suge believed in using fear and muscle to stay in control, while Cube believed in staying independent and handling business through lawyers and keeping his integrity intact. Jerry Heller, who managed NWA, later called Suge pure evil.
I think that even more so now, I think that Suge Knight is an evil human being.
Heller also talked about similar scary tactics, including somebody breaking into his house that he blamed on Knight. This whole pattern created a situation where most people in the industry were constantly paranoid, always wondering when Suge might decide it was their turn to get checked. But Cube? This dude walked through all that madness like he owned the place. But how did it all begin? What made Cube a target for Suge in the first place? Let's break it all the way down. The genesis of a legendary beef. To really understand how Cube and Suge ended up as adversaries, we gotta go all the way back to 1987 when NWA was just getting started. Picture this, you got 5 young cats from Compton, Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, Eazy-E, MC Ren, and DJ Yella, who just revolutionized hip-hop with their raw, unfiltered depiction of street life. But behind all that success was some serious financial f***ery that would eventually tear the whole thing apart.
You know, running up on people, trying to shake them down for 10 grand, and which is something he historically has kind of done.
See, NWA was signed to Ruthless Records, which was co-founded by Eazy-E and managed by this white dude named Jerry Heller. Now on the surface, everything looked good. They dropped Straight Outta Compton in 1988 and the album went crazy. But here's where the story gets messy. Cube was writing the majority of the lyrics, including legendary tracks like F That Police and the title song. But he was getting paid like he was just some background player.
You know, I met Eazy in 84, and he put out the record Boys in the Hood in late 85. We did more records in 86 and 87.
The financial setup at Ruthless was some real dirty business wrapped up in a fancy record contract. Cube had written more than half the bars on their biggest album, but when it was time to see that paper, Eazy was walking away with the bag while everyone else got pocket change. Heller was playing these dudes like they were his workers instead of the creative minds who built the whole sound, even forcing them to sign bad contracts. And Cube peeped game real quick.
He knew that I was asking about the contracts. So I guess he was trying to, intimidate me, or, had this one-on-one, session, me and him just he was just gonna convince me to sign his contract.
Right.
By the end of 1989, Cube was fed up with getting finessed. He tried to sit down and work out a better deal, but when those conversations went nowhere fast, he said, F this, and made a move that would shake up the whole game. He dipped from NWA in December 1989, signed with Priority Records, and started his own thing with Lynch Mob Records.
So when we broke up, I hadn't seen him for years because I'm doing my thing, he doing his. It ain't really friendly.
Now here's where things get really interesting. Cube's departure wasn't just about him getting his money right. It set a precedent that would eventually lead to Dr. Dre having his own issues with Ruthless Records. And that's where our boy Suge Knight enters the picture like a calculated opportunist. Suge wasn't some random dude who stumbled into the music business. This cat was from Compton, had a brief stint with the LA Rams during the 1987 NFL strike, and had been working concert promotion and bodyguard gigs in the hip-hop scene. By 1991, he connected with Dr. Dre through their mutual associate, the DOC, who was also getting screwed over by Ruthless Records. Now Dre was watching what happened with Cube and started feeling the same way about his situation.
This is what I end up hearing after the fact, in doing the movie, that Dre, shortly after I left, it started to get rocky over there with Eazy and Dre.
He noticed that Eazy was getting preferential treatment while his production work, which was basically the backbone of NWA's sound, wasn't being compensated properly. Sound familiar? It's the exact same grievances that drove Cube away.
He was beefing with Dre by then and Death Row, and I was like, yo, work that out.
Suge saw this as his golden opportunity. He positioned himself as Dre's savior, leveraging his industry connections to help facilitate Dre's escape from Ruthless Records. In April 1991, Knight helped secure the release of Dre's contract, along with the DOC and singer Michael Elliott from Eazy-E. This move was absolutely pivotal because it allowed Dre and Suge to co-found Death Row Records that same year, with a distribution deal through Interscope. And just like that, Death Row became a powerhouse. When they dropped Dre's The Chronic in 1992, which introduced the world to Snoop Dogg, it solidified West Coast gangsta rap's commercial dominance and made Death Row the new king of the West Coast. But here's where the beef between Suge and Cube really started taking shape. Cube had already established himself as a solo force with albums like America's Most Wanted and Death Certificate, building his career on complete independence without any of the drama that came with being tied to a major label's politics. Meanwhile, Death Row's rise created this new power dynamic in the Compton scene, Ruthless versus Death Row. Even Eazy-E himself was calling out how Suge was trying to destroy Ruthless Records with Dre's help.
Suge tried to destroy my record company with the help of others, Dre. So right now we're getting everything back together and we finna come out, fully loaded.
That tells you everything about how calculated this whole takeover was. Things got even more complicated in the mid-90s when Suge bailed Tupac Shakur out of prison for $1.4 million and signed him to Death Row. Tupac's addition supercharged the label, but it also introduced new friction with Cube. Pac, fresh from his legal troubles and eager to assert his West Coast allegiance, started seeing Cube as someone who was imitating his aggressive style and thug life ethos. By this time, Cube had shifted focus to Hollywood films like Boys in the Hood and Friday, while still mentoring up-and-coming acts and representing West Coast culture. But Tupac interpreted some of Cube's moves, like telling out-of-towners to bow down in songs, as clout chasing, especially when Cube formed West Side Connection with Mac 10 and WC. Their 1996 album, Bow Down, was all about asserting West Coast dominance during the height of the East-West rivalry, but Tupac saw it as Cube biting his own militant West Coast advocacy. This miscommunication escalated to the point where Tupac was planning multiple diss tracks against Cube after he reconciled with East Coast figures like Nas. Suge, as Death Row's CEO, was inherently tied to this whole dynamic. His label's culture emphasized loyalty and dominance. Dominance with money, according to Mob James.
Suge coming in and he with all these pet bulls. Not me, I'm talking about all the guys he had, sharks. And he controlled everything and everybody with what he paid.
Death Row was becoming the ultimate West Coast powerhouse. Meanwhile, Cube represented this parallel path of success that didn't require Suge's intervention, which had to be threatening to the Death Row brand. This created this undercurrent of beef that was rooted in business envy and stylistic overlap. Cube's continued success in music and film highlighted alternative routes to power, while Suge's hands-on approach built Death Row into a multi-million-dollar entity. But the tension was always there, simmering under the surface. Even when Cube eventually reconciled with Eazy-E before his death, talking for hours about old times and possibly getting NWA back together, the damage between Cube and the Death Row camp was already done.
We got a chance to talk. We just sat and talked, and we talked for hours, just about old times, could we get it back together?
What's really wild is how the geographical element played into all this. Both Cube and Suge were from Compton, which meant they were representing the same streets, but with completely different philosophies. Cube was about artistic independence and building wealth through legitimate business moves, while Suge was about using intimidation and street politics to maintain control.
It's like you go and do all this to people, you shake people down, you threaten people, you extort people, running up on people and trying to shake them down for 10 grand, and which is something he historically has kind of done.
The whole situation got even more complex when you consider the gang politics involved. Suge's connections to Mob Peru Bloods meant that any beef with him carried the potential for real street consequences. But Cube's own street credibility and his refusal to be intimidated meant that he could navigate these waters without backing down. The monster behind the music. Now that we've broken down the beef and its origins, it's time to pull back the curtain and expose the real Suge Knight, the man whose reign of terror made the whole industry walk on eggshells. Because when we talk about why Ice Cube refused to back down, you gotta understand exactly what kind of monster he was standing up to. Marion Hughes Suge Knight Jr. wasn't just some industry executive who happened to be tough. This was a full-blown criminal who used a record label as his front operation.
I don't wish bad luck on nobody, but He did a lot of wrong things.
Standing 6'2" and weighing over 300 pounds during his peak, this dude looked like he could bench press a car. But his physical presence was just the tip of the iceberg. The real terror came from his deep connections to actual gang members and his complete willingness to use violence to get what he wanted. Suge's gang affiliations weren't some casual association. This man was full-blown connected to the Mob Peru Bloods, a Compton-based subset that don't play games. Although more recently, figures like Timmy Rue are coming out to say that Suge lived a fake life.
So that whole image that Suge had was fake. With the red suits, the MOB ring, all that was fake. Wasn't real.
But let's be real. Suge wouldn't just go around throwing gang names if he didn't have backbone. He didn't just hire gang members for security. He integrated them into Death Row's daily operations like he was running some kind of hybrid corporation criminal enterprise. We're talking about members from Mob Peru, Fruittown Piru, and Looters Park Piru working as staff and security, which created an environment where violence wasn't just normalized, it was part of the business model. The internal gang rivalries made Death Row even more dangerous. In the early 2000s, tensions between Mob Peru and Fruittown, Peru led to multiple deaths among Suge's inner circle. But the gang connections were just one part of Suge's arsenal of terror. This dude had a documented history of violence that reads like a criminal resume. In 1992, he pleaded no contest to assaulting 2 rappers at a Hollywood recording studio. The infamous Vanilla Ice situation from the late 80s and early 90s shows you exactly how Suge operated. He confronted the rapper over royalties for Ice Ice Baby, which allegedly included material by Suge's client Mario Johnson.
Suge took me out on the balcony, started talking to me personally. He had me look over the edge, show me how high I was up there.
When Vanilla Ice described what happened, you can hear the fear in his voice even years later. The man said he needed to wear a diaper that day because he was so scared. That's the level of psychological terror Suge could create just by having a conversation.
You scared? I needed to wear a diaper on that day. I was very scared.
But when Suge got called out on these allegations, this dude would flat out deny everything, like his whole rep wasn't built on exactly this type of terrorizing. The playbook was always the same. Scare somebody, make threats, get that money, then act brand new when anybody asked questions about it later. The beefs and drama that Suge stirred up weren't just random personal shit. These were chess moves designed to grow Death Row's power and wipe out the competition. When he clowned Sean Combs at the 1995 Source Awards, that wasn't just some off-the-cuff roasting. That was a planned attack meant to make Bad Boy Records look weak.
Now, Diddy, that famous Source Award speech where Suge got up there and he said, dancing all in the videos and all that. Did you thought that was you immediately, or it had to hit you later?
I really couldn't believe it because homeboy, me and him were friends.
The threats against Puff got so wild that Conrad Tillard had to hook him up with security from Mosque No. 7 just to keep him breathing. Let that sink in for a minute. A music executive needed protection from the mosque because another music executive was talking about murdering him. That ain't business rivalry. That's straight up mob tactics being used in the rap game. Suge's violent reputation was so cemented that other artists would switch lanes completely to avoid any smoke with him. Dr. Dre told Eminem not to even think about dissing Knight, straight up calling him dangerous. When somebody like Dre, who built an empire with this man, is telling people to stay clear, you know the danger is real as hell. The 2015 hit and run that finally got Suge locked up for 28 years shows you exactly how this dude's brain worked. During some drama on the set of Straight Outta Compton, which is crazy ironic since we're talking about Ice Cube's story, Suge drove his truck over 2 men, killing Terry Carter and messing up Cleabone Sloan. Witnesses said he backed up over them twice, which means this wasn't no accident or heat of the moment thing. This was straight up intentional murder. Even Lil Eazy-E, who understood the streets better than most, acknowledged that Suge's way of doing business was completely outdated and dangerous by 2015. The fact that someone from Eazy-E's family was calling out Suge's methods shows you how far outside the lines this dude was operating.
You can't conduct business like we did back in the 90s. You can't sit here and think that I'm gonna grab somebody and put them over a ledge and like Big Red and a 5 heartbeats.
But perhaps the most telling insight into Suge's character comes from how he talked about his own methods. Ice Cube shared this story that perfectly captures Suge's mentality. The wordplay there is chilling. Producing hits, as in songs, versus producing hits, as in violence. That's the kind of psychological manipulation Suge used to control people. He could make threats that sounded almost playful, but carried the very real possibility of physical harm. What made Suge even more dangerous was his unpredictability. The man got shot multiple times over the years. 6 times at a Chris Brown party in 2014, in the leg at a Miami club during VMA's after party in 2005. But he kept operating like nothing could touch him. Someone who's been shot that many times and keeps moving the same way isn't someone who operates with normal fear responses. The psychological profile here is fascinating and terrifying. Suge created an empire built on fear, but he also became addicted to that fear. He needed people to be scared of him because that's how he maintained control. Without that terror, his whole business model would have collapsed. Virgil Roberts, who worked closely with Death Row, broke down exactly why Dr. Dre eventually distanced himself from Suge.
The conflict was Dre didn't want to be around all those criminals. Suge begins to bring all the street guys around.
Even somebody as deep in the game as Dre eventually had to tap out when Suge started flooding the operation with straight-up criminals. That shows you how completely unhinged Suge had become. When your own business partner, the dude who helped you build this whole empire, is bouncing because you're too psycho to be around. This is the absolute demon that Ice Cube stood toe-to-toe with and refused to let punk him. When you really understand the full picture of Suge's violence, his gang ties, his willingness to ruin lives over business beef, and his complete lack of limits, Cube's refusal to fold becomes even more legendary. Looking back, Suge's reign of terror ended up destroying everything he touched. Death Row Records, which could have been the greatest label in hip-hop history, crumbled under all that violence. He thought he could buy friendships with money, but according to Timmy, it just ain't possible.
You can't buy friendships, not even relationships these days. You know, that's where he went all bad at looking out for the wrong people.
But that ain't all. Artists ran for the exits, business partners cut ties, and eventually the justice system caught up with all the criminal shit. Right now, in 2025, Suge Knight is doing 28 years at R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility, and the empire he built through fear. And Intimidation is just a warning story about what happens when you try to run a business like a street gang. But back in his prime, he was the most terrifying dude in hip-hop. And the fact that Ice Cube never bowed down to that terror makes his story one of the most powerful examples of keeping it real and staying brave in the culture's history. While everybody else was checking in, Cube was checking out. And that's what true independence looks like. If you enjoyed this video, click on any of the cards on your screen for more content.